Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's wrap up this series for this go around. I'm going to focus on another set of series afterward and then give this one a pause and then come back to it later on. But thank you so much again for your suggestions. Definitely appreciated doing all these new videos. For this latest video, I decided to go back to the very first suggestion offered in this series a couple of months back. So I went back again and then found this one, and I decided to pick this one because of the very unique circumstances surrounding it. It doesn't have to necessarily do with a disappearance per se. Instead, it has to do more with the mystery associated with this gentleman's death. Even after 30 years, there's still two sides to the argument. One stating that he died of a certain way, and then another one stating that no, that they want more answers because they believe something else happened. So that's why I wanted to go ahead and share that information here. And it has to do with this. You're looking at him now. It has to do in this case with the mysterious death of Jack Davis Jr. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this unsolved mystery. I mentioned those words too specifically because it has to do with the show and how they talked about him, but more on that here in a minute. So who was Jack Davis Jr.? Well, he was someone that was attending, it looks like, the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. This was a place that he was a student at. I don't know exactly how long he was there. Maybe he might have been there a couple of years, or maybe he was somebody that was about to graduate, who knows, but he was at least there during the timeline of October 21st, 1987, the date in this case of his death, or the supposed date of his death. So again, as I mentioned, this is over 30 years now that this last occurred. So this was on a Friday night, and he was attending a party there with his fraternity brothers. It seems like this might have been a usual thing, so much so that when he stated that he wanted to go outside, in this case to a stairwell or a nearby stairwell to urinate, then everything was fine. Like, people didn't think too much of it. I guess it was afterward, when he didn't come back, that's when things, of course, took a different turn. Now, I tried to see, though, if it was where he came back, where he went out but didn't come back immediately and people took a look, or if this was a couple of days later that people suddenly started to realize, hey, where did Jack go? It seems more of the latter, because here's what happened. Apparently he went out to this stairwell to take a leak, and when he did so, he was so intoxicated, he passed out, he vomited onto himself, and in the process actually inhaled that vomit, which caused it to go back into his lungs. Basically, he drowned himself, essentially, in his own vomit, in his own drunken state. And so that's how he was found. He was found at the bottom of the stairwell, in this case, the next morning, if he was found, and I mentioned that more a little bit, why that's disputed too, but he was found there on a Saturday morning by other people that were coming across that location. And so that was the immediate conclusion. Here was an unfortunate accident, a tragic one, if this is to be believed, because here he was, just somebody minding his own business, but he was too drunken in his own state, and so because of it, he ended up dying right then and there. So if that truly was what occurred, then it's an truly unfortunate way. It's like one of the worst accidental ways to essentially go out in your life, because here he was basically about to start his life after finishing his stay there at the university. So that was at least one side. The authorities believe that's what it was in terms of the case. There was a kind of like an inspection done on his body, and it was determined that yes, this is what occurred as well when it came to the circumstances. So for all intents and purposes, the authorities decided at that point that that was it. They gave that explanation to his relatives, and then that was finalized. But his relatives, though, had another idea. To them, they thought that this was not the case, that this could have been something else, that this was something that was more along the lines of he was placed there to make it look like he died that way. And this is why they contacted, about 2 years later, his family received a notice. A friend of theirs told them to contact a pathologist, a guy by the name of Dr. Cyril Wecht. I hope I'm saying that last name correctly. It's spelled W-E-C-H-T. Well, they told them to contact because they wanted to see if he could offer a second opinion into this case. I think also that they truly believe that from the get-go it's one of those things where they were saying, no, this is not my son. Like, this is not how he would have died. He would have been more responsible. That kind of stuff. You know how most family members automatically think, in this case, of the more positive aspects of someone. So to them, they're thinking there's no way that he would have just died drunken in his own vomit down a stairwell after drinking too much. No, they wanted something else. So he decided, this Dr. Witch decided to go ahead and do his own examination. And he did so not only looking at the original report, but then also convincing the authorities to actually exhume Jack's body. So this was, again, 2 years after this fact. And when he did so, he found some interesting things. Apparently, in the report, the original report associated with the police, there was no mention of any alcohol in his blood. So whenever the blood was drawn after his death, none was found there. Also, interestingly enough, he was clean shaven at the time of the party, but when he was found, he had a stubble on his face. So I don't know exactly, like, if someone passes away, if hair continues to grow. Somebody might need to point that out. But that also came up as an interesting thing because people realize, the timeline associated with his disappearance would have been a longer time period. That's why I was mentioning earlier how when his body was found on the Saturday after, and it could have been something where he was actually disappeared even before that time period rather than the Friday itself. And then also, apparently, this vomit that was coming over, like in other words, that he drowned on within his own body, it was impossible because there was apparently very little food or maybe no food that was found in his lungs. So kind of a lot of things coming out all of a sudden, isn't it? Like when it comes to this stuff contradicting whatever the earlier reports were stating. And then on top of that, the guy or the person that originally completed the autopsy. Remember I was mentioning earlier how they did one and then they were able to come up with those conclusions tied to his drunken death. In this case, Dr. Witch was able to convince the authorities to actually go about and then bring up his body one more time, like bring it up from its resting state there in the graveyard, because he wanted to take a look at one specific thing, and that was Jack's skull. And when he brought it up and he was able to look at the skull in person, he found several fractures associated there in the skull. Fractures that are usually caused, in this case, by blunt blows, like let's say somebody hitting him right then and there. So this was all stuff, of course, that stood out immediately when it came to his own conclusions, and they were contradictory to all the other stuff beforehand. But his going theory was that Jack did not die in a drunken state in his own vomit. Rather, he died by those fractures, and whoever decided to do this to him, in other words, that blunt force to his head, made it look like, in this case, he died on the stairwell by accident instead. So, as far as why this could have happened, who knows? But the case was reopened back in October of 1990. So, in this case, almost 3 years later. And when that happened, the authorities decided to try to find and see what what occurred between them. The closest that people could come up with is this. Jack's fraternity, the one that he was in some kind of feud between other fraternities, not just one, but two other fraternities. So apparently it must have been such a bad feud, such a bad malice between the two parties or three parties that there's a suspicion that there must have been a fight on the campus somewhere around that time period of that night or maybe a little earlier. And when that happened, that's when he was injured by the other party. He ended up dying from that injury, and then whoever did that essentially placed him on that stairwell so that way they could try to make it look like an accident. So when that occurred, it was almost like death by accident, but still he ended up dying. That's at least the theory that was at that time whenever the case was reopened back in October of 1990. Unfortunately, the theory has never been confirmed because there was never any other evidence found tied to it. So no corroborating evidence in terms of eyewitness reports, no evidence, I guess, in terms of fingerprints, nothing, not even like hair samples, nothing like that. No, in this case, it was opened, but it was left in an unsolved status. So to this day, 30 years later, there's still in open status and officially, like it can be investigated at any point. It's just that it's probably after 30 years not exactly going to be on the forefront of these authorities and their investigations going forward. But what do you guys think? That's all the information associated with, in this case, the mysterious death of Jack Davis Jr. Was he someone that died in his own drunken state, in this case in his own vomit, there on the stairwell near the university? Maybe those fractures occurred because he passed out and then he was hitting his head, who knows, on the actual steps or maybe on some of the metal items or metal bars nearby. Who knows? Or is it the other stance? Do you go more with the family and the idea that he could never have done this to himself? Instead, it was somebody else, some other person who remains mysterious to this day, causing his death and then placing it there as an so-called accident. Let me know what you guys think. Post your comments below. This was actually featured on Unsolved Mysteries. That's why I mentioned those words earlier when it came to it, because it was featured back in 1995, and so it was in a way re-examined on a nationwide basis. You're talking about 8 years or so later after his death. But even with that nationwide stance, even with so much more, I guess, of a broad approach to trying to get witnesses or any type of evidence, to this day, no, there's still been nothing else that can confirm 100% other than the actual stance that the authorities took in the first place. So, but what do you guys think? Again, please post those comments below. So, all right, everybody, thanks again as always. Take care.